Now, we're at the moment in which the United States is gripped by the greatest financial monetary crisis in modern history, at least since the beginning of the creation of our republic. Now, although the United States has been in a process of decline from its former greatness as an economy over more than 3 decades, the majority of our citizens, including leading figures in government and other leading circles, have been for recent times in a state of denial about the reality of the way this present crisis came into being. And this destruction has been going on for at least 3 decades. It was made conspicuous beginning the process of the U.S. entry into the war in Vietnam, and it became acute with the entry of an extreme right-wing government, actually a government with fascist intentions, that of President Richard M. Nixon. And since that time, especially since the events of August 1971, the United States has been destroying itself, not inch by inch, but yard by yard. There has been no recovery from the ongoing deep collapse in the U.S. economy at any time during the recent 3 decades. There has been no successful presidency, no successful Congress in power in the United States on the record in the past 3 decades. We have been destroying ourselves inch by inch. That destruction is caused by the consent of a majority of the people to cultural and other changes in policy which destroyed bit by bit everything that had been built up in our history, including during the immediate periods following the war. So therefore, the blame for the problem does not lie with George W. Bush. George W. Bush is the thing that prevents the cure, but it is not the disease. The disease is the disease which is carried by previous governments of the United States and by the behavior of a majority of the citizens who did vote or could have voted in the past 3 decades. And therefore, the problems we had to cure today is to correct the mistakes not only of this president, and his mistakes are grand in scale. Monstrous, I think, is a better term than grand, isn't it? No. But to induce the people, or at least a majority of the people and a majority of leading influences among Democratic and Republican Party leaders in the United States, to recognize that they have been complicit in the crime of the destruction of the United States, its economy, and the destruction of the security of global civilization. Because we are truly at this point on the verge of a new dark age. Now, the difference today is that Franklin Roosevelt did solve the problem bequeathed to him particularly by the Coolidge and Hoover administrations, which were disasters. Today we have an attempt to replicate in the form of a farce the same kind of disasters that were executed under Coolidge and under Herbert Hoover. Remember that under Herbert Hoover, after the Depression began, after the great monetary collapse of the stock market collapse of 1929, that Hoover, after that time, lowered the income of the United States by half, and creating the disaster which Roosevelt tackled in March of 1933 when he actually entered office. That was a success, but we have a much more serious problem this time. Roosevelt's philosophy, or the practice which we're going to do, policy we're going to do from this practice, was successful. Those precedents will work today in general, but they are not adequate. In the past 3 decades, we have destroyed the U.S. economy in a way far in excess of the lowering of the U.S. economy by 50% during the past 3 decades. We have done damage, permanent damage to this economy which didn't exist then. The way Roosevelt organized the recovery was to reach out to resources we still had, to farms that still existed, to industries which are more or less shut down but could be revived, to labor forces that had skills, productive skills that they'd had in the 1920s. And he mobilized these resources and created new resources and built recovery. Today, through the cultural paradigm shift, as it's called, which was introduced actually in the post-war period with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was actually a fascist organization in terms of its ideology. We produced, recall this, those of you who can live to recall it, we produced a degeneracy in the U.S. population under the influence of the Congress for Cultural Freedom during the 1950s in particular. We produced what was called white collar, the white collar syndrome, what was called the organization of man syndrome. We moved people into suburbia, out of the cities, to new industries developing in suburbia, around the cities. Children went to school under the influence of a right-wing philosophy in which they learned not to tell the truth. Don't say it. Be careful what you say. Be careful what you're overheard saying. Your father might lose his job. Learn to say things that are approved. Follow Dr. Spock in raising your children. And we produced a generation called the baby boomer generation, which by and large had lost the fiber of morality on which we had depended under Roosevelt to recover from the Depression, to conduct the greatest struggle against fascism the world could imagine. Without us and without Roosevelt, there'd been a Nazi empire over this world by the 1940s. Without the resistance to fascism in this country by Franklin Roosevelt, we too would have been a fascist state, as many intended to make us that at that time. Without the United States buildup of its economy, we would not have had the industrial machine by means of which the Nazi empire was defeated. Without the United States leadership under Roosevelt, without the U.S. economy developed under Roosevelt's leadership, we would have had a Nazi empire ruling the world. And the way this was done was because Franklin Roosevelt was able to recall from within the intestines of a people a memory of that which had made the United States possible and which had caused its achievements. What happened during the post-war period to the pretty children in suburbia, working in the nice jobs, the nice factory where they kept their nose clean and told lies all the time in order to get by. When they were hit by the missile crisis of 1963, 62-63, when they were hit by the assassination of Kennedy, when they were hit by the entry into a war in Indochina, they collapsed morally. We had the great cultural paradigm shift, which we call the 68er shift. We had a generation which left reality, which said they hated industry, they hated agriculture, they hated blue-collar people, they hated our culture. They were going to have a new culture. And this change from 64 to 68 among a generation which was victimized by the influence of the Congress for Cultural Freedom on the children in suburbia. These children cracked under these crises. They cracked morally in large degree. And that made possible the anti-industrial development, the other kinds of cultural change, which became the threat of fascism with the inauguration of President Nixon. Now, the fascists in this thing were not so much Nixon. Nixon was a broken man. He was not a good man. But he was not the architect of fascism. The architect of fascism was people who were still around. Rick Nixon is dead. George Pratt Schultz is still around. It was Schultz and company who organized the inside of the Nixon administration. It was Schultz who was behind Kissinger in launching the crisis we now see in Lebanon back in 1965. This is 75. This is a product of Schultz, who brought Kissinger into power to create the mess which we're now looking at in Southwest Asia. So the crimes of Kissinger actually come from people like Schultz. Look at, and I'll get something from this series here, which Claude will now put on. Just a review of the statistical evidence, county by county of the United States, which we've done, a sampling of this, to show an example of how the United States economy has been consistently destroyed under every presidency since beginning with Nixon. This is just an indication of the shrinking of the economy of the state of North Dakota. Now, what happened essentially is that we have destroyed, under every particular presidency, we have destroyed our agriculture. So that where you saw rich farms in the past, where you saw industries, you've seen decay. You've seen a new kind of dust bowl, an economic dust bowl, in the areas of industrial development and agricultural development of the past. Under every presidency since Nixon, we have been destroying the U.S. economy. No presidency, no session of Congress has done anything to halt this. But every presidency, every session of Congress has increased the ruin of the United States. Go on with C, just to get rapidly to get some overview of this. What we've done is we've taken the census, the economic census of the United States county by county, and we have examined the physical condition of agriculture and industrial production, employment and so forth, county by county for the United States. And the kaleidoscopic picture you get is one of a systemic destruction of the U.S. economy under every presidency, under every session of Congress up to the present time. Okay, if we've got more of this, we can get back to the question period if people want more of this on these questions. All right, so no one can say that it was Bush that started this process, this Bush. It is we, the United States, our political parties, our leaders, and our popular opinion, especially that of the baby boomer generation, which has engineered the self-destruction of the U.S. economy. And similar processes have occurred in Europe. You have, the destruction took two phases. You had the first preliminary destruction was under Nixon. Under Nixon, under the influence of especially George Pratt Schultz, the man behind controlling Bush and controlling the governor of California today. That under Conan the Destroyer of California, we went through two phases. First phase was to destroy the structure of policy. The destruction of the international monetary system was the first step. 1971, August 15th, 16th, 1971. This, we destroyed the United States' commitment to the Bretton Woods system. In the following year, George Shultz at the Azores Conference had a war against the resistor France under President Pompidou of France. Had a war on which the United States prevailed and thus imposed upon internationally an international agreement on the IMF itself, which destroyed the system. In other words, the United States betrayed the system in August of 1971. The United States acted to destroy this world system, the IMF system, with the Azores Conference, in which George Pratt Schultz presided. Since that time, we have had a general collapse of the international financial monetary system as well as the U.S. national system. The second phase came with the succession under which National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger was replaced by his twin, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski. The man who's close to Satan, I think. Now, what Brzezinski did in particular is Brzezinski engineered, under Carter, Carter didn't do it, Brzezinski told him to do it, engineered what was called controlled disintegration of the U.S. economy. This was a doctrine adopted by Brzezinski's group called the Trilateral Commission, created by Brzezinski, which became the new government under Carter. It was not a Carter administration, it was a Trilateral Commission administration. And the Trilateral Commission administration carried over into the Nixon administration, where the Nixon administration had more members of the Trilateral Commission in it than even the Brzezinski administration. What Brzezinski did with deregulation was to destroy the structure of the U.S. economy. Kissinger, Schultz and company under Nixon, destroyed the system, the international system. What Brzezinski did was to destroy the internal structure by deregulation of everything. Agriculture was first, trucking, air transport, industry, everything. Now, what happened was, for example, we used to have in the, we refer to the county organization. We used to have in the United States a fairly developed distribution of industries. That every part of the country which had any pride, every state and many counties in these states would have agriculture or a mixture of agriculture and industry and infrastructure. Large water systems of which they could be proud. Water management systems for agriculture and other purposes, built by the Corps of Engineers and others. We'd have industries all over the country. We'd find a local industry here and there. In every state, you'd have industry. We had regulated transportation. You could produce in any county and get delivery of service for shipping and receiving from centers through a national transportation system, which is regulated. Under Brzezinski, they destroyed that, and now the production was concentrated in a few large areas with super corporations, and local industries, local counties, local regions of the country went into bankruptcy. We introduced conditions of slave labor in truck driving, for example, through deregulation under Brzezinski. We destroyed our railroads more than ever before under Brzezinski. So these two steps from approximately 1969, when Nixon came in, into about 1972, when certain other changes were made, destroyed the United States as an economy. And this free trade idea, pushed forward, meant that where we had protected high technology industries, we now said we're going to break the back of the countries of South America and elsewhere. We're going to collapse their economies. They're going to produce things for us cheaply. We are going to export our industry and agriculture to slave labor in countries whose backs we have broken. We're going to utilize and loot the cheap labor resources and mineral resources of the world. And we're going to feed people through Walmart instead of having real stores where you can buy real things. And that's how we destroyed the economy, step by step over these years. The next stage came where I was very fortunate in a sense to make one of my famous successful forecasts. In the spring and summer of 1987, I warned that what was happening now meant that we were on the verge of an early October general collapse of the stock market, which occurred in a timely fashion, just as I had forecast. Now, the reaction to this was that you had Volcker, who had presided over the destruction of the U.S. economy through the Federal Reserve System up to that point, was replaced by Alan Friedman, who was much crazier, much more. So Friedman told everybody to halt because he was coming in as the new Federal Reserve chief. and he would take care of it. Now, what he did is he invented a new kind of economy to replace the old economy. He invented what we would call gambling side bets to replace real economy. These are called financial derivatives or hedge funds. And therefore, we have now created in the international system, which we have destroyed. We've destroyed the physical base of Europe, the physical base of economy in the United States and elsewhere, relying upon looting the cheapest labor in the world for what we get, and we can't even pay for it anymore, as our current account deficit shows. So now we've created a debt based on what are called financial derivatives. No one knows how big this debt is because most of it is unregulated and unaccounted for, but it's there. These are promissory notes against gambling side bets on the world economy. This gambling is now being used for what is now in the process of absolutely destroying the world system. This is why we're on the edge of a general collapse, a general breakdown of the present world monetary, financial, and physical economic system. A chain reaction collapse can happen at any time. You cannot predict exactly what such thing will happen under these conditions, but you know it soon, and it's coming down. Because what has happened is the active part of the world economy, as it's called today, is not what we used to think of before 1987 as an economy. What is happening is the speculative money associated with hedge funds and other things, financial derivatives, is now concentrated on what? On buying up control over the future raw material supply of the planet. There is no shortage of petroleum, for example. There's more than adequate petroleum being produced today to meet the world's needs. Then why is the price zooming towards $60 a barrel and higher? Some forecasting as high as $140 a barrel from a stable level of 25. Why? Because of a shortage of petroleum? No. This is not a market problem. This is not a supply-demand problem, the way some fools will say. What is happening, you have bidding with the weapon of financial derivatives and hedge funds on control of the future supplies of all categories of major raw materials on this planet. That's the market. That's where the business is. Therefore, imagine the effect now of $60 a barrel oil. We're about that level right now. Now, outstanding, of course, are many contracts at lower levels. So the cost of petroleum at the pump has not yet reached the level that corresponds to approximately $60 a barrel on current new contracts. But it will if this continues. What then happens? We have this in steel. We have this in every category of primary materials and their immediate derivatives globally. What you have is a big international power grab by these circles to take over and destroy the world, to make a new kind of world where most people starve to death and a few people control the world by controlling the raw materials upon which their existence depends. That's the game. There's no way that you can organize this kind of system or tolerate this kind of system of raw material speculation of this type with hedge funds and have an economy. Therefore, you're now at a steep curve, the steep part of the curve, where we're now in the area where an immediate general collapse of the world economy is now about to occur.